G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Zechariah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you. The book of Zechariah, we're into chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 10, verse 7 tonight. Bit of a recap on last session. We covered the question of whether the fasts that they were practicing should continue. Should fasting of the 5th month be continued? That was the 9th of Av. Why were they fasting? They were fasting because of the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. You know, God says to them, he says, did you guys fast unto me, even to me? Their fasts were never for the Lord. These fasts were never commanded by God. They were instituted by themselves. Why? Because Jerusalem was destroyed, so they were upset. They're unhappy. And Jerusalem was destroyed. Why? Because of disobedience to the prophets. Had they obeyed the prophets, the question of fasting would never have come up, because they'd never have been destroyed. So why concern yourselves with that which was not commanded, which is the fast, when there is plenty that was commanded by God through the prophets? That's pretty much what God is saying to them. So rejection of the prophets resulted in their rejection, the people's rejection by God. And judgment came. They cried, but he didn't respond. Eventually, as we see through the scriptures, there comes a time of no return, and they went past that time. So eventually, they were scattered, partially in the Babylonian captivity. Final fulfillment of the dispersion, the scattering, was in AD 70 when Rome smashed Jerusalem. But God said that he will return to Jerusalem. He will dwell in Jerusalem because Messiah will rule from it. And there is going to be a future restoration, and there will be future prosperity for Jerusalem. So the message to Zechariah's generation was, listen to the prophets, and God will bring about good to Jerusalem and to Judah. Now, regarding the fasts, God had not commanded these fasts, so it took him a while to answer the question. So what he says, listen, whatever you do regarding these fasts for now doesn't matter to God. He said, if you want to keep them, you can keep them. Don't want to keep them, you don't have to keep them. All of these fasts will someday be turned into feasting. And because of this, God says, I want you guys to love, truth, and peace. Okay. So today we're into chapter 9, verse 1. This is the first burden of the word of Jehovah. This goes from chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 17. Chapters 9 to 14, we're going to see two burdens. The first one is chapters 9 to 11, and it's one unit of complete prophecy. Chapter 9 to 11 is one prophecy. Second burden covers chapter 12 to 14, and that's also a single unit of prophecy given to Zechariah. Now, just a summary of this first burden. First of all, we're going to see here, Zechariah will talk about Israel's rejection of the true shepherd and the subsequent turning over of all Israel to the Gentiles, so that they're used to punish Israel for rejecting their true shepherd. Secondly, he's going to point out that there will be judgment upon the Gentile world. Third, Israel will be strengthened to withstand the Gentile invasion until a physical and spiritual redemption comes by means of the true shepherd, Jesus. So pretty much these are the three basic points that this first burden of Jehovah makes. And Zechariah, he doesn't necessarily deal with them in this order, but it's a basic summary of what we're gonna cover. So in the first of these burdens, we see how Zechariah prophesies the conquests of Alexander the Great in chapter 9. And this is chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. And this is about Alexander the Great. The burden of the word of Jehovah upon the land of Hadrach, Damascus, and Damascus shall be its resting place. For the eye of man and of all the tribes of Israel is toward Jehovah. And Hamath also, which borders thereon, Tyre and Sidon, because they are very wise. And Tyre did build herself a stronghold, and heaped up silver as the dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her, and he will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire. Verse 5. Ashkelon shall see it and fear, Gaza also, and shall be sore pained, and Ekron for her expectation shall be put to shame. And the king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. And the bastard shall dwell in Ashdod, and I'll cut off the pride of the Philistines. And I'll take away his blood out of his mouth, and his abominations from between his teeth. And he also shall be a remnant for our God. And he shall be as a chieftain in Judah, and Ekron as a Jebusite. Okay. Now, what are these verses here doing? These verses are prophesying the conquests of Alexander the Great, which he fulfilled in the year 332 BC. So it starts out here with the burden of the word of Jehovah. And this is the first of two, which we said. The second one is chapter 12 to 14. Now, as he begins describing the conquest of Alexander the Great, Zechariah now shows us the area geographically, beginning with Syria. Syria is just north of Israel. And he says here that when this burden comes, this judgment comes, it comes upon the land of Hadrach, which is another name for the land of Syria. And then he moves into the capital city of Syria, which is Damascus. Why is that? Well, you know, if you're a conqueror, you're going to go to the capital cities. That's where Alexander is going to head. He's going to head to Damascus. And the text says, Damascus shall be its resting place. In other words, Damascus is the goal of this burden that Zechariah has been given. It's the goal of the conquest of Alexander the Great as far as Syria is concerned. So that's Syria we've just taken care of. And then he makes a little side statement here. It says, for the eye of man and all of the tribes of Israel is toward Jehovah. So this is a little side statement here, emphasizing that God is in control. Yeah, even though Alexander's coming down, God is in control. And it's something at which Israel at that time clearly recognizes. They recognize that, hey, you know, this Alexander stuff, God's in control of this. And then he gives us another geographical point also in Syria, and that is Hamath, which borders thereon. So Hamath, it borders the area controlled by the city of Damascus, which is the capital of the land of Hadrach, which is Syria. Okay. The next country now turns to is Phoenicia, and that's in verses, second part of verse 2 and then to verse 4. And there are two key cities in Phoenicia. Phoenicia is just it's today Lebanon. Two key cities of Phoenicia were, first of all, Tyre and Sidon, and both of which are mentioned here in the passage. Now, God also allows them to be invaded by the armies of Alexander as well, because he says they are very wise. You'd think, oh, they're very wise. What does that mean? Yeah, it's a rhetorical statement here. It's expressing the thought that they're very wise in their own eyes. They think they're pretty smart. And then now he focuses on Tyre alone and says, Tyre did build herself a stronghold. Yeah. Originally, the city of Tyre was on the coastline of Phoenicia, but this wasn't a very defensible position, and so it was easily taken. So what they did was they moved the city, they moved it off the coast, and they rebuilt it on an island about 800 meters offshore. So there's an island offshore. They built the city on the island, and this island stronghold had walls 45 meters high, and is something mentioned in Isaiah 23 verse 4. So that made the island of Tyre virtually impregnable, with 45-meter walls, mate, and you're out in the sea out there, pretty difficult to scale your walls. Now we see in history, Shalmaneser. Who's Shalmaneser? Well, he was the emperor of Assyria. He actually besieged Tyre for 5 years, and he couldn't take it. And so Nebuchadnezzar, from Babylon, he comes along and he besieges it for 13 years, and he couldn't take it. And something else here it says about Tyre. It says that Tyre stored up silver and gold in abundance. She heaped up silver as the dust and fine gold as the mire of the streets. And Ezekiel 28, 1-5 tells us the same thing here. So here we have this Tyre, which is built on this island, 45-meter walls, 800 meters offshore. So your armies can't really get to it very easily. Boats can't scale the walls, so it's out there and it's chockers with silver and gold. It's no wonder they felt as though, hey, no one can touch us out here. But now comes God's judgment upon them, and he says 3 things. He says, first of all, he says the Lord will dispossess her. And secondly, he will smite her power in the sea. And third, she shall be devoured by fire. And this came to pass exactly the way it was prophesied. Alexander comes along, and rather than trying to besiege the city by using his navy, what did he do? Alexander, he built a causeway from the coastline out to the island. And in actual fact, you can still see it there today. And he then besieged the city, and after only 7 months, it fell. So the previous two empires, Shalmaneser from Assyria and Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon, 5 years and 13 years, Alexander comes along. He says, hey, hang on, let's just build a causeway out there, and we'll besiege the city that way. And the city fell in 7 months. Now, when it was taken, 8,000 residents were killed by the sword, 2,000 others were crucified, 13,000 were sold into slavery, and what was left was burned. And all of this was what was prophesied. So this is Tyre. Now, Tyre was the shining light, if you like, in that area. It seemed to be impregnable. And now, in verses 5-7, Zechariah now turns to Philistia. And there we're going to see a bit of an interplay between 4 of the 5 Philistine cities here. Remember, the Philistines didn't not have one single king. They were they had 5 kings ruling in what was known as the Philistine Pentapolis. And now Zechariah, he's going to deal with 4 of these royal Philistine cities. And first of all, the first one he deals with is a place called Ashkelon. And he says 2 things about Ashkelon. This is Zechariah prophesying. He says, Ashkelon shall see it and fear. See what? When Ashkelon was down the coast, when Ashkelon saw that Phoenicia, Tyre, could not withstand Alexander the Great, and especially when those Greek armies overran Tyre, fear now grips them, because they thought they'll be up there for years trying to knock down Tyre. And their fear is well founded, because Zechariah says Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. So Alexander is going to come down and he's going to destroy the city. So they're a bit fearful. They knew they were next in line. Then he deals with a place called Gaza. He says 2 things about Gaza. First of all, he says they will be sore pained, because they'll also be attacked. And the king shall perish from Gaza. Now, in the fulfillment of this prophecy, Alexander besieged Gaza for 5 months. And finally, he captured it, and he took the king of Gaza, a guy called Batis, B-A-T-I-S. And what he did was, he tied him to a chariot, and he had him dragged to death behind it. Yeah, Alexander's a pretty cruel guy. He also killed 10,000 of the residents there, and what he did with the rest of them was he made slaves out of them. So we have Ashkelon, Gaza. The third city now is Ekron, and he says two things about Ekron. First of all, her expectation shall be put to shame. What was her expectation? Her expectation was that Tyre would withstand the siege of Alexander, and then he would not be able to proceed southward to Gaza. But unfortunately, their expectation was shattered because Alexander did succeed in taking Tyre. And secondly, Ekron would be as a Jebusite. What does that mean? Jebusites, who were they? The Jebusites were the people who originally held Jerusalem until King David took it from them. And this means Ekron would also be conquered, and Ekron would become a servant, and finally Ekron would disappear. And this is exactly what happened to the Jebusites. Any Jebusites who were left were incorporated into Israel, and this is what we see in Joshua chapter 15 verse 63, 2 Samuel 5 verse 6 to 9, and 1 Kings 9 20 to 21. So what we see here is that the Ekronites were eventually incorporated into Israel, just like the Jebusites were. Now, the fourth city is Ashdod. And the prophet simply says, a bastard shall dwell in Ashdod. This means a bastard or illegitimate race of people will live there. And we see this is fulfilled in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 7 and Nehemiah 13, verse 24. He next deals now with the Philistines as a whole, and he points out four things to these four little kingdoms here. First, in the second part of verse 6, I'll cut off the pride of the Philistines. What does that mean? It means that the Philistine nation came to an end. And secondly, her idolatry will cease. And the two statements referring to idolatry here are, first of all, he says, I will take away his blood out of his mouth. Now, this refers to the practice of drinking the blood of sacrifices as an act of worship, or of eating the victims with the blood. And this is a practice strictly forbidden to the Israelites. So they didn't eat people. Well, not as sacrifices. Second, and his abominations from between his teeth. So they're going to take away his blood out of his mouth and his abominations from between his teeth. And this is possibly or probably a reference to temple prostitution. All of this means that idolatry will now be cut off from the Philistines. And third, he says, he shall be a remnant for our God. Now, what this means is that some Philistines will be saved and they'll be incorporated into Israel. And fourth, when they're incorporated into Israel, it says, he shall be as a chieftain in Judah. So, during the course of time, some Philistines are going to have a degree of leadership within Israel. And now, if you notice here, we only did four cities. There's 5 cities, but one of those cities is a place called Gath, G-A-T-H. Now, Gath, by this time, had already been incorporated into Israel. They were destroyed by Israel. Now, in chapter 9, verse 8, we see the protection of Jerusalem. Remember, Alexander's coming down the coast. We're going to see the protection of Jerusalem. And verse 8 of chapter 9, and I will encamp about my house against the army, that none pass through or return, and no oppressor shall pass through them any more. For now have I seen with mine eyes. So God now makes a promise that no matter what happens to these other places when captured by Alexander the Great, he says he will protect Jerusalem from destruction. The first part of verse 8 was fulfilled in the time of Alexander. where he says, I will encamp about my house against the army. God will not allow Alexander to destroy either Jerusalem or the temple. This was fulfilled, and there is both history and legend connected with it. Now, legend says this. Legend says that as Alexander and his army were approaching Jerusalem, they were coming down intending to destroy it, the high priest in Jerusalem, in all his priestly garb, with the turban on the head, and the robes and everything, he came out to meet Alexander. And suddenly, this is the legend, and suddenly when Alexander saw him, he fell to his knees. Alexander fell to his knees. Now, this was a great surprise to Alexander's generals, but he later explained to them why he did that. Again, remember, this is just legend. In the legend, we're told that before he had left Macedonia to move out on his conquests here, Alexander had a dream in which he had seen a man dressed in the same kind of clothing the high priest was wearing. And in his dream, a voice had said to him, that's what the legend says, when you see this, fall on your knees. So when he saw the high priest coming to meet him, he obeyed the voice he had heard in his dream. And again, this is legend, right? This is not scriptural. Historically, though, we do know historically, Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. He did not put Jerusalem under any direct tribute. He didn't put them under subjugation, but he did allow the high priest to become the ruler over the city, subject to Greek authority. But the high priest was the ruler over Jerusalem. And then goes on to say in the prophecy, none shall pass through or return. So I'll encamp about my house against the army, and none shall pass through or return. Alexander did not enslave Jerusalem, neither did he return to put the city under any kind of tribute. He left it alone under the high priest. Now, the second part of verse 8, what we see here is it awaits its fulfillment in the millennium, the Messianic kingdom, where he says here, no oppressor shall pass through them anymore. Why do we say it's the millennium? Well, because there's been lots of oppressors since Alexander's day. So in fact, Jesus' day, the Romans were the oppressors. So this part of the verse could only be fulfilled, or can only be fulfilled, in the Messianic kingdom. And we see this out of Isaiah chapter 60, verse 18. Second, for now I have seen with mine eyes, what's this? This is simply a reference to the way the eyes of God will look upon Jerusalem to make sure that both the near prophecy about Alexander and the far prophecy in the millennium will both be fulfilled. That's what it means when it says that I have seen with mine eyes, God speaking. So he's saying, I'm making sure this is going to take place just like this. Now we see the coming of the king. And this is in chapter 9, verse 9 and 10. Yeah. What we're going to see in these two verses here, we have a messianic prophecy here. Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. Zechariah was just talking about the Greek king, it's in verses 1 to 8, and now he goes to the Jewish king in verses 9 to 10. Verse 9 deals with the first coming of Messiah, while verse 10 deals with his second coming. And what we see here is that, here we have an example here of one of the four different types of messianic prophecy here. And this is where we blend the first and second comings into one picture. So you see one picture, but you got to understand it through various other scriptures, what they're talking about. So verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes unto you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. So there's this blended picture. He begins in verse 9 with a call to rejoice on account of the first coming. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. You're not to fear, nothing to be frightened about. And the reason that they should be glad and shout is, for your king comes unto you. Notice he says, your king. So this is a Jewish king we were talking about here, not a Greek king. Greek king has been talking about in verses 1 to 8. He's coming to you. He's not coming against you. He's coming to you. Messiah is not coming against the Jews. He's coming for the Jews. That was his first coming. He came to seek and save the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then he now gives us a description of this king. And he says three things about him. First, he's just. So this Jewish king is characterized by righteousness. And this is something we see in Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 5 to 6 as well. Alexander the Great wasn't righteous. Alexander the Great died in a drunken stupor. He was never ever characterized by righteousness. Second, this is the Jewish king. He has salvation. He has deliverance. Alexander, what did he do? Alexander didn't bring deliverance. Alexander brought death and destruction. Everywhere Alexander went, that's what followed him. Third, he's lowly. And this word in Hebrew means that he was brought low by oppression. So this is a Jewish king. He was brought low by oppression. When did we see that? Well, Isaiah 53 verse 7 says Messiah was oppressed. So he was brought low by oppression. Alexander came on the scene with great pomp and all the trappings of earthly power. How did Messiah come? In verse 9, we have the manner of the Jewish kings coming. He'll be riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. The word foal here, what's that means? It means it's a young donkey, a young ass that hasn't yet been broken. Nobody's ridden it before. And so what we see here is that Jesus, he rode into Jerusalem on the back of an unbroken donkey. Usually when you with an unbroken animal, when you put something on its back, it jumps and bucks everything, but it didn't throw Jesus off. A bit of a miracle. Now, Alexander, we know that he rides upon a white horse. So what we see in these two verses here, this is a fulfillment of Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 to 11, where Matthew quotes Zechariah. In Matthew, some specifics that are fulfilled in the Gospels. First of all, we see in Matthew 1:1 that he is Zion's Jewish king. Secondly, he came on to and for the Jews in John chapter 1, verse 11. Third, he's just, which is affirmed by Isaiah 53, verse 11. And fourth, he is lowly, affirmed by Isaiah 53, verse 2. And fifth, he has salvation, which Isaiah 53, 11 confirms that. So there are some things about the Messiah, the coming Jewish king. Now, this is the second coming. This describes the second coming. So verse 9 is the first coming, verse 10 is the second coming. Now he says, and I'll cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace unto the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. So, Zechariah is now dealing with the second coming, and he points out three things relevant to the second coming. First of all, this is going to mean that all instruments of war will be removed from Israel. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. So Ephraim represents the northern kingdom. That was used to be, when it was divided, that was Israel in the northern kingdom, Judah the southern kingdom. So Jerusalem is where? In the southern kingdom of Judah. So both here, what we see both here is both are now united, because we have Ephraim from the north and Jerusalem from Judah. Both are now united under the rule of the king who is Messiah, Jesus. Now, second, Messiah will cause peace to come worldwide. He shall speak peace to the nations. When the Bible speaks about nations, it means the Gentiles. He will speak peace to the Gentiles. Third, he will set up his messianic rule. Why? Because his dominion shall be from sea to sea. Now, what we see here is in the context of Israel, this refers to both the eastern and western borders of the land. First sea is on the east, which is the Dead Sea. The other sea is on the west, which is the Mediterranean Sea. And we can see this from the borders of the land from Exodus 23, verse 31. Exodus 23, verse 31. Now, how far is Messiah going to rule? It says here that his dominion will also be from the river onto the ends of the earth. Which river is he talking about? Well, when it says the river, it means the Euphrates River. And the Euphrates River defines the northern border of the promised land. And according to the Abrahamic covenant, one would expect to see here, one would expect to read that the southern border would be the brook of Egypt. But instead, Zechariah doesn't say that. It says it will be on to the ends of the earth. So we have east and west borders, the northern border, but the southern border, it says it will be to the ends of the earth. What's he saying here? What he's doing here is he's pointing out that primarily, while Messiah will be ruling personally in and over Israel from Jerusalem, at the same time, he is going to rule the world because the border extends right around the ends of the earth. So Zechariah looks at his dominion as spreading beyond the southern border to cover the entire world. And this, if you look at Psalm 72, verse 8, you'll see the same terminology here. And that also describes Messiah's rule. Now, so here we have an example of two types of messianic prophecy. Now, some see Messiah as suffering, lowly, humble, and dying. Others picture him as conquering and ruling. So these are the two prophecies. So when the rabbis, right, when the rabbis looked at these contradictory prophecies, one dying, one suffering and dying, one conquering, they said, whoa, they had to come up with a two Messiah solution. And this is what they did. First Messiah would come, whom they call the son of Joseph. This is factual. They call the son of Joseph. Son of Joseph, he comes to fulfill the suffering passages. He'll be followed by Messiah, the son of David, and he'll be the conquering Messiah. So our solution, the New Testament solution, is far simpler than that. New Testament tells us that there's only one Messiah who comes to earth twice. Once to die and be resurrected, and then second time to come to rule. Now, another rabbinic explanation from the ancient times, it says this. Rabbis quote previous rabbis. Rabbi Joseph, the son of Levi, objects that it is written in one place, behold, one like the Son of Man comes with the clouds. But in another place it is written, lowly and riding upon an ass. So their solution is, if they be righteous, this is Israel, if Israel is righteous, well, Messiah will come with the clouds of heaven. But if they're not righteous, he'll come lowly riding upon an ass. So this second type of rabbinic explanation is to point out that either one or the other type will be fulfilled. If Israel is righteous, he'll come riding on the clouds and fulfill those prophecies. But if Israel is sinful and not righteous, he'll come riding upon an ass. So in the rabbinic view, Messiah will fulfill either or, but not both, right? But the scriptures, the Bible, demands that both types of prophecy be fulfilled. So it is better to see that Messiah comes twice. First time to die, second time to rule. Now we have the redemption the salvation and restoration of Israel. We see this in verses 11 to 17. As for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I have set free your prisoners from the pit wherein is no water. This is chapter 9, verse 11. Turn you to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Even today do I declare that I will render double unto you. For I have bent Judah for me. I have filled the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and will make you as the sword of a mighty man. Jehovah shall be seen over them, and his arrow shall go forth as a lightning. And the Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet, and will go with whirlwinds of the south. For Jehovah of hosts will defend them, and they shall devour, and shall tread down the sling stones, and they shall drink and make a noise as through wine, and they shall be filled like bowls, like the corners of the altar. And Jehovah their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people, for they shall be as the stones of a crown, lifted on high over his land. For how great is his goodness, and how great is his beauty! Grain shall make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins. So, how will verse 10 be fulfilled? That's the question. Zechariah deals with the salvation, redemption, restoration of Israel. In this section, he begins here with redemption in verses 11 to 17. And this is how we get a better picture of how verse 10 is going to be fulfilled in its relationship to Israel. In verses 11 to 12, his point here is that Israel is going to be freed. And the basis of that is in verse 11. According to your covenant. And this is a reference to the foundational Abrahamic covenant. As for you also, that is, as for Israel, because of the blood of your covenant, the Abrahamic covenant here, this was a blood covenant. It was signed and sealed by the shedding of blood in Genesis 15, verses 18 to 21. And on that basis, on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, blood covenant, God says, I will set free the prisoners from the pit wherein is there no water. Wherein is there no water. Pits without water were usually dry cisterns, which were sometimes used as prisons. That was the kind of pit that young Joseph was put into by his brothers prior to being sold back in Genesis 37:24. Also in Jeremiah was thrown into a pit in Jeremiah 38, verse 6. So in this passage here, what we see is that Jews confined to this kind of pit are going to be freed on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. And just as in the book of Exodus, God intended to free Israel from Egypt on this same basis. So this will be their future deliverance, the Abrahamic covenant. In verse 12, he points out that there is a principle of rendering double for Israel's sins. So he says to those who have been released, turn ye to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Now the stronghold is a place of safety, that's Jerusalem. Captives who have good hope of deliverance, because why? Because they're in covenant with God. They're still in covenant with God. Now, the concept here of doubling relates both to punishment and to blessing. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 2 and Jeremiah 16 verse 18 bring out the doubling of punishment for Israel's sins. That's the one you don't want. But then Isaiah 61:7 brings out the doubling of Israel's blessings. And this principle of double blessing belongs to the firstborn. Now, has it referred to Israel? Well, guess what? Israel is the firstborn among the nations, according to Exodus chapter 4, 22 to 23. So Israel is the one who has double. She's the firstborn. So God applies this principle to Israel. So God now says, even today do I declare that I will render double unto you. Double blessing. Firstborn. In verse 13, he now points out that God is going to empower Israel to withstand the Gentiles. I have bent Judah for me. So Judah has now become like a bow in God's hands, so as to be able to shoot his arrows. But so who's his arrows? He says, I have filled the bow with Ephraim. Judah is the bow, Ephraim is the arrow aimed at their enemies. And he goes on to say, and I'll stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. So God on one hand addresses Zion, on the other hand, Greece, Zion, Jerusalem, Israel, on the other hand, Greece, showing that he rules everybody. Now, we saw there's a very similar thing happened in the Maccabean Wars, although the ultimate fulfillment of this here, this is still future, because this points to Israel's final deliverance. So this is still, just after the tribulation, end of the tribulation. So he says, I will make you as the sword of a mighty man. So the picture here is that in the final wars of Israel against the Gentile nations, God will empower and energize the Jews to be able to fight their wars as well. Zechariah will detail this once again in chapters 12, 1 to 9. Now, it's not really Israel who will ultimately defeat the Gentiles, because we'll see in verses 14 to 16, the Gentiles will be defeated by God himself. But he's just saying that Israel, is like a mighty man. He can wield a sword. He can defeat anybody at that time. Now, verse 14 here describes God's intervention. Jehovah will be seen over them. The picture here is of Jehovah hovering over the people, just as we saw the glory cloud in the wilderness, hovering over Israel or leading Israel. So the glory cloud is here, hovering over them. And secondly, he says here that Jehovah is the bowman. He's the archer. Judah is the bow. Ephraim is the arrows. God is actually the archer. He's the bowman. Third, the Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet to stir up their sons to war. Fourth, he will advance with the winds of the south. So what these winds are the very hot, what they call chumsin winds, which cause people to dry out and become extremely thirsty. So these are some of the means that God will use to accomplish this task here. And then in verse 15, it describes the defense. Jehovah will defend them. And second, they shall devour and subdue, because with Jehovah defending them, they're going to be able to do this. And third, he says, Israel will make a noise as through wine. So Israel will rejoice when they see their enemies defeated. And fourth, it says, they will drink their blood. Not literally. They won't literally drink their blood, because that would violate the Mosaic Law at that time, according to, in this day and age that they're in. It's in the sense of shedding the blood of those who attack them. And fifth, they shall be filled like bowls, like the corners of the altar. So with the sacrificial system, the bowls, the silver bowls were filled with the blood of the sacrificed animals, and then it was poured out at the corners of the base of the altar. And that's what's going to happen with the blood of Israel's enemies. And then treading down the sling stones, which we just read over, what they're going to do is they're going to contemptuously trample on the hostile missiles, which will fall harmlessly onto their feet. Now in verse 16, he now spells out their deliverance here. First of all, Jehovah, their God, will save them. So he is the one who will come to their rescue. Second, they shall be as the stones of a crown. The sling stones were worthless before. Now, here's Israel. Israel will be like the stones of a crown. They're going to be lifted on high over his land. In contrast here to the worthless sling stones, which were just trodden underfoot. These guys, these are the stones of the crown. Now, in that day it refers to the day of the Lord. Right? It's a reference to the end time. It's a reference to the tribulation period. In that day, they're going to be like the flock of his people. He will tend his people as a shepherd tends his flock. And then finally, in verse 17, there is praise as a result of deliverance. Now, Zechariah points out four things here. First of all, he says, how great is how great is God's goodness? Second, how great is his beauty? How great is the goodness and beauty of God in what he has done? That's what he's saying. And third, he says, grain shall make the young men flourish. So what's going to happen is there'll be a superabundance of crops. And fourth, a new wine the virgins. So there's going to be a time of merrymaking because of God's redemption of Israel. And that is coming. Now we see the salvation of Israel in chapters 10, 1 to 7. Ask ye of Jehovah rain in the time of the latter rain, even of Jehovah that makes lightnings. He'll give them showers of rain to every one grass in the field. For the teraphim have spoken vanity, and the diviners have seen a lie. And they have told false dreams, they comfort in vain. Therefore they go their way like sheep. They're afflicted, because there is no shepherd. Mine anger is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the he-goats. For Jehovah of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them as his goodly horse in the battle. From him shall come forth the cornerstone, from him the nail, from him the battle bow, from him every ruler together. Verse 5, chapter 10. And they shall be as mighty men, treading down their enemies in the mire of the streets in the battle. And they shall fight, because Jehovah is with them. And the riders and horses shall be confounded. And I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. And I'll bring them back, for I have mercy upon them, and they shall be as though I had not cast them off. For I am Jehovah their God, and I will hear them. They of Ephraim shall be like a mighty man, and their heart shall rejoice as through wine. Yea, their children shall see it and rejoice. Their heart shall be glad in Jehovah. Now, Zechariah deals here with the salvation of Israel, and we have a promise here in verse 1 that when this salvation occurs, the blessings of rain will be restored. Now, when the Bible talks about rain in the land of Israel, there are four different descriptions of it. There is the former rain, which we see from the Hebrew Yoreh, which is around about October, November. It's light, drizzly rain. The second is the Hebrew Matar, which is ordinary rain, few showers. Third type of rain is Geshem, which is heavy rain. And the fourth type is Malkosh, which is the latter rain. Now, the former rain falls in October, November, and then we have a bit of an interchange between ordinary and heavy rain during the months of November to February, and then the latter rain falls during March and April, and then comes the dew season between April and October, when there's no rain whatsoever. It's just relying on the dew. Now, Zechariah here discusses three different types of rain as part of Israel's restored blessing. He says, ask ye of Jehovah rain in the time of the latter rain. Two rains there. In other words, ask for Geshem in the time of Malkosh. So during March, April, the latter rains begin to dissipate, die out. And when it does rain in that period, it is usually only very light showers. But what Zechariah says here, he says, ask for heavy rain in the time of the latter rain, when the rain is dying out. Ask for heavy rain and you'll get it. In other words, ask for little and you will get much. And then he says, even of Jehovah that makes lightnings. So Jehovah, God, is the one who is able to accomplish such things. So he is the one to give them showers of rain. And this means he'll give them ordinary rain as well, to every one grass in the field. What does he say? He says, listen, there'll be enough rain to sustain every single blade of grass throughout the country, and none will dry up because of a lack of rain. There'll be rain all the time. Everything will be watered. Everything will have sustenance. Now, this was a promise in the Mosaic Law. It was clearly stated that in the Mosaic Law, there'll be blessings of rain for obedience and the withholding of rain for disobedience. But in the Messianic kingdom, they'll receive abundance of rain just for the asking, simply as a result of Israel's salvation. And we see that promise in the Mosaic Law in Leviticus 26, 3-4, and Deuteronomy 11, 13-15. In verse 2, he points out to Israel the failure of both her idolatry and her false prophets. And talking about their sin of idolatry, first of all, he says, for the teraphim have spoken vanity. The teraphim, what are they? They're those little household gods that they had. In this idolatry, they're failed, mate. Then he details the failure of the false prophets. The diviners have seen a lie. This means that the visions they had seen were deceptive, lying visions. Second, they have told false dreams. They might have well have been dreaming, but they have not had prophetic dreams, because these were not from God. These were just false dreams. Third, they comfort in vain. Well, because they provide only false comfort, they can't tell the truth. And this false comfort actually leads to judgment. So all of this, what happens is it resulted in the scattering of the flock of Israel. Therefore, they go their way like sheep. They are afflicted because there is no shepherd. So because of these false prophets, therefore Israel was now scattered. And we're going to see this later on in Zechariah 13, verse 2-7. In verse 3, first part, we see the failure of Israel's shepherds. Mine anger is kindled against the shepherds. This is God's anger against the Jewish leaders. They're the shepherds, the Jewish leaders, because it is the leaders are the ones who are guilty of leading the flock astray. We'll see more of this in verse 4-14 of chapter 11. He says, I will punish the he-goats, those among the common people who conspire with the leaders to lead the people astray. The he-goats lead the flock. They who are first in crime will be first in punishment. Now, when the Lord says, I punish the he-goats, he's talking about the leaders in Israel. They should have been leading their people. So the shepherds, leaders should have been leading the people. And what happens is, the ordinary folk who conspired with the shepherds, they're leading the flock astray. So what they do here is that instead, what we see here is these guys were false prophets. They're giving him false comfort and actually leading him away from God rather than to God. In second part of verse 3-5, he deals with the fact that Israel is now going to be empowered to withstand the Gentile armies. In verse 3, for Jehovah of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them as his goodly horse in the battle. What we see here is that the Jewish forces will be empowered to withstand their enemy. In verse 4, he focuses attention upon the Messiah. And he points out that from him will come forth things. From Messiah will come forth things. First, from him shall come forth the cornerstone. So from where? From him, from the house of Judah, the cornerstone is the foundation stone. And Messiah is often pictured in Scripture as the foundation stone. We first see him in Isaiah 28, verse 16. And you see it in Hebrews 7:14 as well, and Matthew 21:42. Second thing, from him the nail. What's the nail? Well, the word means tent peg. And what happens in those days, a peg was fixed to the main supporting pole in the tent, and a man would then hang his valuables on it. The point here is that all that is of value will hang upon the Messiah personally. Third thing, from him will come the battle bow. The battle bow refers to the weapon God uses, which is Judah and Ephraim, we just saw before. And this is by whom the false shepherds are going to be removed. The battle bow. Fourth, from him every ruler together. So what we're going to see is that among those who do have rightful authority of Israel, their source of authority will come from Messiah. In verse 5, we're given the result of this empowering and energizing of Israel. They shall be as a mighty man. This means that they'll be victorious in battle, treading down their enemies in the mire of the streets in the battle. So every weapon used against Israel will be made ineffective. And they shall fight because Jehovah is with them. They'll be energized by God. The rider on the horse shall be confounded. So every entity brought against Israel is going to be neutralized. Finally, in verses 6-7, he points out here that Israel will be saved. And verse 6, we have the rescuing of Israel. And he says 6 things in regard to the rescue. First of all, he says, I will strengthen the house of Judah. God's going to energize them. Second, I will save the house of Joseph. Now, energizing alone will not deliver them. God himself will deliver them. Third, I'll bring them back. So God's going to regather them. Fourth, I'll have mercy upon them. He will save them spiritually as well. Fifth, they shall be as though I had not cast them off. Israel will be so restored and so saved that it will appear that they were never cast off or scattered in the past. It'll just seem like they're always like this. 6, what's the reason? The reason is, for I am Jehovah their God, and I will hear them. As God is going to rescue Israel in verse 6, that's going to lead to the results in verse 7. Ephraim shall be like a mighty man. They'll be mighty in battle. Their hearts shall rejoice as through wine. They're going to be joyful over what God has done for them. Yes, their children shall see it and rejoice. So the descendants of those who actually experience the restoration will also see it and rejoice. Their hearts shall be glad in Jehovah. So even these descendants who are born throughout the kingdom period will come to, these Jewish descendants will come to saving faith. And that's your lot for tonight.